seem strange saying this, but actually learning is a natural process for human beings. We learn all the time. I mean, you've learnt a hard lesson this morning about how cold it can be in a school hall on a Saturday morning when the heating isn't on. You'll also have learnt briefly what I look like, what I sound like. You know, you didn't know this before. You haven't made a huge effort to learn those two things. They've just happened. But all the time, every day, whatever we're doing, we are learning in that way. And a lot of it is what you call incidental. You're not intending to learn, it just happens. Then there's learning that we do which is more deliberate, when you're trying to acquire a skill or you're intending to learn something. Now, how we perceive ourselves, and not only how we perceive ourselves, but our identity, plays a huge role in determining what we attend to and what we actually learn. You may have, sometimes been in a crowded room and you're having a conversation with somebody, and then over the other side of the room somebody mentions your name, and you suddenly turn round. This is because our brains are tuned into things which are important to us, because we can't attend to everything all the time. There's just too much information out there in the environment. So the way the brain operates affects what we attend to incidentally, in that sort of kind of way of hearing your own name, or if you're driving along in the car, you might be thinking about something, and then suddenly on the radio something might come up that's really important to you, and you'll suddenly change your attention to hear it. What we want to learn, again, crucially important for our identity, how we go about learning it, because we have different preferences. That doesn't necessarily mean we can't learn in other ways, but we're more comfortable with some, and particularly important, whether we persist in learning, because motivation is crucial to all of it. So what's the role of the teacher? Well, teaching has been viewed in all sorts of different ways. An art, a science, the latest thing seems to be it's a craft, but we've been there before as well. So there's lots of different ways of looking at teaching, but what is absolutely crucial is teachers cannot learn for their learners. They can help them, they can support them, but unfortunately, you can't just plug your, have a kind of direct link from your brain to the brains of learners, which just makes that happen. That's why it's so hard to teach, because you have to facilitate, you have to engage your learners, you have to motivate them. And that really is the crucial thing about teaching. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we now know about the brain. This is relatively new in one sense, because the technology simply hasn't been there before. Our brain is a fantastic organ. We have to remember it is a physical organ. So it relies on, the same kinds of things that your other organs do, in all kinds of ways. But it has something, billions of neurons, billions of them. And each one of them, we believe, has the processing capacity of a small computer. So the capacity that we have to learn is massive, and we don't use it all. When we learn, what happens is the neurons have connections, axons and dendrites, and as we learn, they gradually link up, so neurons effectively have a joining mechanism. And as we learn, that becomes stronger, and the more we engage with a particular thing, not only does it become stronger through a process of myelinization, which is rather like insulating tape, I guess you could say, those connections get stronger and stronger and faster, so that a lot of learning becomes automated. We don't have to think about it. We couldn't function if this didn't happen. Every time we speak, we don't have to think about every individual word. That has become automated. We're thinking about the message that we want to communicate. And that applies to everything. If we don't use things, pruning occurs, things die. Although some things are very resistant to that pruning mechanism, particularly motor skills. If you learn to ride a bike, you tend to always know how to ride a bike. So those sorts of things are particularly resistant. But an awful lot of things, as I said, are very resistant to forgetting, but some pruning occurs. You will forget what my voice sounds like probably the minute you leave here. There won't have been time to build up a connection to make that strong enough. But through those processes, everybody, all of you, have a completely different brain. Because over time, what has happened is the things that you have engaged with have developed those areas of the brain in relation to that. So if you're a musician, then the particular parts of the brain that are involved in processing music will have developed more. And if you're a violinist, the particular parts of the brain that deal with finger movements and how they relate to sound will have developed more. If you're a percussionist, it'll be the parts related to rhythm. If you're a conductor, it's the parts related to aural space. And I gave you an example of music, but actually in London, taxi drivers have to learn the knowledge. And that means, you know, they have to learn where all the roads are, and they have to pass tests. And you see them driving around on little scooters with maps attached while they're learning this. And again, brain research has shown that the part of the brain that deals with spatial knowledge in that sense develops in those taxi drivers. And this happens with everything. So it's kind of irrelevant what area it is. Whatever you spend a lot of time doing, your brain will respond to that. And I've already covered those points. So if we think of the way the brain learns, then it makes sense to think of learning as the development of expertise. Now this challenges the notion of ability. We're a bit obsessed with ability in this country. And that has, there are historical reasons for that, which I won't go into. But the point is, if we think of it, learning, rather than here you are, you have that ability, we think of it instead as this is where you are now in developing expertise in whatever area it is. At primary level, for instance, we now have in some places, we have children coming into school whose home background has been such that they have simply not developed language skills. And that, you know, the schools are setting up nurture groups to try and engage those children, get them talking, get them in a social kind of activities so they begin to talk and understand what that means. Well, those children, if they're 4 or 5 coming into school with no language, are going to take a while to catch up and may never completely catch up within the school phase of time with children who've had extremely extensive language activities in the home. So if you think of learning in terms of the development of expertise, from an educational point of view it's good because it means that there's always the possibility of going on and learning more. But it also means that you have to stress where we are now. The other thing about this thing is it stresses the importance of time. Time is very important. It takes time to learn things. And so from a school point of view, that is particularly important because it's no use rushing through a curriculum because then what will happen is you end up learning nothing very well. And once you're outside of that particular area, it will disappear. It also focuses on specific skills. So, I have expertise. I used to be a professional musician. I then did a psychology degree, master's and PhD, and I also have a lot of experience in education. But I know absolutely nothing about nuclear physics because I, haven't studied it for physics since I was at school for a long time, and my knowledge was fairly limited. That doesn't mean I couldn't acquire it, but it would mean that time being spent. So there may be some transfer between things where they're close to each other. So there may be some general things, for instance, depending on language, that, if you've learned language really well, then you may be able to use it in different contexts. But generally speaking, those sort of levels of expertise do not easily transfer. And I can give you a musical example. Lots of professional musicians who learn in a classical genre do not learn to improvise or play by ear because that's not in their training, and they find it really hard to do that. And there was a study in Japan where they compared people who'd had classical training with those who hadn't on learning a song by ear, and the ones who hadn't had the classical training but had spent quite a lot of time doing karaoke learnt the song much quicker and to a much higher standard than those who'd been to conservatoire. So even within a domain like music, your expertise can be quite focused in particular areas. The paradigm also explores how processes change, because obviously you learn along with the knowledge domain, you learn skills and strategies which relate to it. So, I've said some of this already. Experts excel mainly in their own domains. When they're expert, they perceive large, meaningful patterns very quickly, whereas a novice might be looking at detail. The expert will get the overall picture immediately. They're very quick. So again, same task, you know, somebody who's expert at something will do it much, much quicker than a novice. They remember more. This is not because they have a greater capacity for memory, it's that they draw on that knowledge that they already have in order to deal with new problems. And they represent those problems at a deeper level. So they would be looking at probably principles rather than the detail. And they spend longer analysing the problem before they attempt to solve it. So in other words, they've got a good grasp of what needs doing, which again, the novice may just charge in and try to do things. And probably most important, they've got strong self-monitoring skills. So they know whether actually this is looking as if this is going to work. And if it's not, they back off and try something else, whereas the novice might get a great way down a particular path and not be realising that they're not doing it right. If I give you another musical example, beginners very often will learn mistakes simply because they don't know what they're aiming for. They don't know what the outcome should be.